They say a mother's love is unconditional, but what about when her child sends you poison disguised as care? My hands haven't stopped shaking since I opened that chocolate box. The lab results are still burning holes in my purse, proof that my own son wanted me gone. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I'm 73 years old, and I live in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a brownstone in Brooklyn. The elevator broke down 3 months ago, and nobody's bothered to fix it. So every morning, I climb those stairs with groceries, laundry, and the weight of disappointment that gets heavier each year. My knees creak like old floorboards, and my back aches from sleeping on a mattress that should have been replaced years ago. The wallpaper in my kitchen is peeling at the corners. Yellow flowers faded to something that looks more like cigarette stains. I make my coffee in the same chipped mug I've used for 15 years, the one with the crack running down the handle that cuts my finger sometimes when I'm not careful. The steam rises and fogs up the window that looks out onto the fire escape, where Mrs. Chen from next door hangs her laundry, even in winter. Every morning I check my phone hoping for a message from David, my son. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes there's a request for money, typed quickly with no greeting, no warmth, just numbers and deadlines. Mom need $800 for rent by Friday. That's how love comes to me now, in demands and desperation. But that Tuesday in November, there was something different waiting outside my door. A brown cardboard box, dented at the corners, with my name written in David's familiar handwriting. The letters slanted like they always did when he was in a hurry, the way he used to write thank you notes to his grandmother when he was 12, and I stood over him making sure he finished them. My heart jumped a little. David never sent gifts anymore, not since I couldn't afford to help him buy that investment property in Queens 2 years ago. I told him I'd already taken out a second mortgage on this place to help him through his divorce, and I just couldn't do any more. He hung up on me that day, and our conversations became shorter, colder, more transactional. But here was a box with my name on it, and underneath, in smaller letters, for Mom's health. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them twice before I got the door open. Inside, I sat at my small kitchen table, the one that wobbles because one leg is shorter than the others, and carefully opened the package. Inside were chocolates. Dark chocolates in a fancy box, the kind I used to buy myself when I worked at the department store and had a little extra money each month. But underneath the chocolates, wrapped in tissue paper, were bottles. Small brown bottles with white labels, the kind you see at health food stores. The labels said, Premium Multivitamin Complex and Advanced Joint Support. I held one of the bottles up to the light coming through my kitchen window. The capsules inside were a murky brown color, not the bright orange or yellow I was used to seeing in vitamins. They rattled loosely when I shook the bottle, and there was something about the sound that made my stomach turn. But I told myself I was being silly. David had finally thought of me, finally remembered that I'd been complaining about my arthritis, about how tired I felt all the time. The note was brief, written on a scrap of paper torn from what looked like a grocery list. Mom, these will help with your joint pain and energy. Take 2 with breakfast every day. Love, David. The word love looked rushed, like it was an afterthought. I tried one that evening with dinner. It went down hard, leaving a metallic taste in my mouth that water couldn't wash away. I told myself it was normal, that all vitamins tasted awful. But when I woke up the next morning, my stomach felt like it was burning, and my head was pounding in a way that wasn't familiar. For a week, I took them faithfully. Every morning with my toast and coffee, 2 brown capsules that made me grimace. My neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, noticed I looked pale when she saw me checking my mail. Mija, you okay? You look tired. I told her about the vitamins, how my son had sent them to help with my health. She frowned, her weathered face creasing with concern. Maybe you should ask doctor first, no? But I didn't want to ask the doctor. I wanted to believe that David cared. that this was his way of making things right between us. So I kept taking them, even as my hands started shaking worse than usual, even as I found myself too dizzy to walk to the corner store some days. Let me tell you about David, about the boy he used to be before money changed everything between us. He was born during one of those August heat waves that make New York feel like a furnace. His father, Michael, and I were living in a studio apartment in Queens then, barely making rent on Michael's job at the loading dock and my part-time work at a diner. David came into the world screaming, and he didn't stop screaming for the first 6 months of his life. But when he finally smiled, it was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. He had these huge dark eyes and tiny fists that would grab onto my finger and hold on like he never wanted to let go. I used to walk him through Flushing Meadows Park when he couldn't sleep, pushing that old stroller with the squeaky wheel, singing lullabies my mother used to sing to me. Michael left when David was 8, just packed a duffel bag one morning while I was at work and left a note on the kitchen counter saying he couldn't do this anymore. David found the note when he came home from school. I came home to find him sitting at that same wobbly kitchen table, holding the piece of paper and crying silently. He didn't ask where his father went. He just folded the note carefully and handed it to me. After that, it was just David and me against the world. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Mornings at the diner, afternoons cleaning offices downtown, evenings watching the neighbors' kids for extra cash. David learned to make his own breakfast, to walk himself to school, to do his homework alone at that kitchen table while I collapsed on the couch between shifts. But we were a team then. He would save me the good parts of his lunch, a cookie or an apple, wrapped in a napkin in his backpack. When I came home exhausted, he would make me tea in my chipped mug and tell me about his day. We watched old movies together on Friday nights, sharing a bowl of popcorn and dreaming about the day our luck would change. I sacrificed everything for that boy's future. When he got accepted to college, I took out loans I knew I'd never be able to repay. I sold my mother's jewelry, the only valuable thing I owned, to help pay for his textbooks. When he wanted to study abroad for a semester, I worked double shifts for 6 months to send him spending money. "Mom, you're the best," he used to say, hugging me tight when I handed him another check. "I'm going to pay you back someday, I promise. I'm going to make it up to you." And I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because a mother's hope is sometimes stronger than common sense. After college, David got a job in finance. Nothing fancy at first, just an entry-level position at a small firm in Manhattan. But suddenly, he was wearing expensive suits and talking about investments, about stocks, about making his fortune in the market. He moved into a nice apartment in the city, started dating a woman who worked in real estate and wore designer handbags. That's when the requests started. Not for small amounts anymore, but for serious money. "Mom, I have this opportunity to invest in cryptocurrency, but I need $5,000 to get started." "Mom, Sarah and I want to put a deposit down on a condo, but we're just short on the down payment." "Mom, my car got repossessed, and I need help getting it back." Every time, I found a way. I mortgaged my apartment, the same apartment I'd lived in for 20 years. The only stable thing David and I had ever had. I took advances on my credit cards, borrowed against my small retirement fund. I told myself it was an investment in his future, in our future together. He was going to be rich someday, and he would take care of me the way I'd taken care of him. But the promises started coming with conditions. "Mom, I can't call you every week like before. I'm really busy with work." "Mom, maybe you shouldn't come to family dinner this Sunday. Sarah's parents are coming, and it might be awkward." "Mom, I don't need you to do my laundry anymore when I visit. I can handle it myself." The distance grew slowly, like a hairline crack in a wall that you don't notice until the whole thing comes tumbling down. Phone calls became text messages. Text messages became silence. Visits became rare, then rarer, then almost non-existent. David married Sarah in a small ceremony in the Hamptons. I found out about it from a Facebook post. a picture of them kissing on the beach with the caption, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. I stared at that photo for an hour, trying to understand how my son could get married without telling me, without inviting me, without even wanting me there. When I called him crying, he was annoyed rather than apologetic. Mom, it was just a small thing, family only. What am I then? I asked. You're my mother, but Sarah's family is different. They have different expectations. Different expectations. That phrase stuck with me for months. I turned it over in my mind like a stone, trying to understand what it meant. Did it mean they expected mothers to be quiet, invisible, undemanding? Did it mean I'd done something wrong by working 3 jobs to support him? By mortgaging my home for his dreams? The birth of their daughter Clara should have brought us closer together. I thought maybe being a grandfather would remind David what family meant, would help him understand why I'd sacrificed so much for him. When I heard Sarah was pregnant, I started knitting tiny blankets, saving money for a crib, imagining myself as the grandmother who would babysit and spoil and love unconditionally. But when Clara was born, I learned about it in another Facebook post. A hospital photo of Sarah holding a tiny pink bundle with David beaming beside her. Welcome to the world, Clara Marie Henderson, the caption read. The most beautiful girl in the world. I called the hospital and asked to be transferred to Sarah's room. David answered the phone, and when I heard the exhaustion in his voice, my heart softened. David, honey, congratulations. I'm so proud of you. Can I come visit? I have gifts for Clara, and I'd love to help however I can. There was a long pause. In the background, I could hear Sarah talking to nurses, the beeping of hospital machines, the ordinary sounds of new life beginning. Mom? David finally said, Now's not really a good time. Sarah's tired and her parents are here. Maybe in a few weeks. A few weeks turned into a few months. When I finally met Clara, she was already sitting up, already smiling, already 6 months of life I'd missed. David and Sarah brought her to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, and I could see Sarah looking around with thinly veiled disapproval. The peeling wallpaper, the wobbly table, the cramped quarters where I'd raised her husband suddenly seemed shabby and embarrassing through her eyes. Clara was beautiful, with David's dark eyes and Sarah's delicate features. She let me hold her for exactly 10 minutes before she started fussing, and Sarah quickly took her back. She's not used to new people, Sarah explained, though I noticed Clara had been perfectly content with the grocery store clerk and the mailman on the way up. That visit lasted an hour. David spent most of it on his phone, taking calls about work, even though it was Sunday. Sarah bounced Clara and made polite conversation about the weather, about how hard it was to find parking in my neighborhood, about how they needed to leave early to beat traffic. When they left, David hugged me quickly, distracted, already thinking about whatever came next. When can I see her again? I asked. Soon, Mom. We'll figure it out. But soon never came. There were always reasons. Clara was teething. Sarah was overwhelmed. They were traveling. David was working late projects. The stock market was keeping him busy. He'd started making serious money by then, buying and selling cryptocurrency, investing in tech stocks that paid off big. The irony wasn't lost on me. The son I'd supported through years of struggle was now wealthy beyond anything I could have imagined. While I was still climbing 3 flights of stairs with groceries, still wearing the same winter coat I'd bought 10 years ago, still making do with the chipped mug and the wobbly table. But I didn't resent his success. I was proud of him. When I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd bought a house in Westchester, when I saw pictures of his new car on social media, when the woman at the grocery store mentioned that her daughter worked with David and he was doing very well for himself, I felt a mother's pride mixed with hope. Maybe now that he'd made it, maybe now that he had everything he'd dreamed of, he would remember the woman who'd made it possible. The requests for money continued, but they changed in nature. Now they weren't about survival, about rent or car payments or basic needs. Now, they were about opportunities, about investments that required large amounts of capital, about business ventures that could make him even wealthier. "Mom, I need 50,000 to buy into this real estate deal. It's a sure thing. I'll pay you back with interest in 6 months." I wanted to ask why someone who owned a house in Westchester and drove a luxury car needed $50,000 from his mother who lived in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. But I didn't ask because I was afraid of the answer, afraid of the silence that might follow, afraid of losing the little connection we still had. So I found ways to get him the money. I reverse mortgaged my apartment, signing papers I didn't fully understand to unlock equity I'd spent decades building. I cashed out my small retirement account early, paying penalties that ate into money I'd need to survive my later years. I took advances on credit cards, juggling payments and interest rates like some kind of desperate financial circus act. Each time I sent money, David was grateful in the moment. "Thanks, Mom. You're saving my life here. I promise I'll pay you back as soon as this deal closes. You're the best mother in the world." The words felt good when I heard them, like sunlight on my face after a long winter. But the warmth never lasted, because the promises were always broken. The sure-thing real estate deals fell through. The 6-month repayment schedules stretched into years. The gratitude turned into expectation, then into irritation when I couldn't provide more. "Mom, you know I'm good for it. Why are you being weird about money all of a sudden?" I started avoiding my mailbox because I couldn't face the credit card statements, the loan payments, the documentation of my financial ruin. I started shopping at the discount grocery store, buying generic brands and expired meat marked down for quick sale. I started wearing sweaters indoors because I couldn't afford to heat my apartment properly. But still, I told myself it would be worth it. David was building something, creating wealth that would eventually benefit all of us. When he made his millions, when the investments paid off the way he promised they would, we would all be better off. I would have a comfortable retirement, maybe even move closer to him and Clara. We would be a family again. The delusion was comfortable until it wasn't. Until I realized that David's wealth was growing while mine disappeared, that his comfort came at the cost of mine, that I was being systematically drained to fund a lifestyle I would never be invited to share. The wake-up call came gradually, then suddenly. Birthdays forgotten. Phone calls ignored. Visits canceled at the last minute. When I got pneumonia 2 winters ago and spent 4 days in bed with a fever, unable to get to the grocery store or pharmacy, I called David's number over and over. It went straight to voicemail. When he finally called back 3 days later, he was annoyed that I'd left so many messages. "Mom, I was in meetings. You can't expect me to drop everything every time you get a cold." A cold. 4 days of fever so high I was seeing things that weren't there, so weak I could barely make it to the bathroom. A cold. When I fell on the stairs last spring and sprained my wrist, I called David from the emergency room. "Can you pick me up? I don't think I can manage the subway with this cast." He was busy. Sarah was busy. They'd call me back. I took a taxi home, spending money I didn't have because my son couldn't spare 2 hours to help his mother get home safely. But the cruelest cuts were the smallest ones. Being excluded from family photos. Learning about family vacations from social media. Hearing Clara call David's mother-in-law Grandma, while I remained Mrs. Henderson, or sometimes just David's mom. Sarah's mother, Patricia, lived in a beautiful house in Connecticut and had never worked a day in her life. Her husband had been a successful lawyer, and she spent her retirement gardening and hosting book clubs and taking art classes. When Clara stayed with Patricia, there were photos, baking cookies, reading stories, playing in gardens that looked like something from a magazine. When Clara stayed with me, which was rare, there weren't photos. My apartment wasn't photogenic enough for social media. My activities weren't interesting enough to document. I was the emergency babysitter, the last resort, the grandmother you called when other plans fell through. Clara loved me, though. I could see it in her eyes when she looked at me, in the way she would reach for me when she got tired or scared. She was the one bright spot in my increasingly dark world, the one person in my son's new life who seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. "Tell me about when Daddy was little," she would say, curling up next to me on my small couch. And I would tell her stories about David as a boy, about the time he tried to make me breakfast in bed and burned the toast so badly we had to open all the windows, about how he used to sing made-up songs while he did his homework. Clara would listen with wide eyes, as if I was telling her fairy tales about a magical person she didn't quite recognize. "Daddy sang songs?" she'd ask incredulously. "Daddy burned food?" It broke my heart to realize that the joyful, creative boy I'd raised had become a man his own daughter barely knew. But those moments with Clara were stolen time, borrowed joy. Sarah would inevitably cut visits short, claiming Clara had activities or needed her nap or had been away from home long enough. "She gets overstimulated in new environments," Sarah would explain, though my apartment was hardly new to Clara, and she seemed perfectly calm in my arms. I began to suspect that Sarah saw me as a threat, as competition for Clara's affection. Not serious competition, of course. I was just the poor grandmother in the shabby apartment. But still, Clara lit up when she saw me in a way that might have made Sarah uncomfortable. Children have a way of seeing through surface things, of recognizing love in its purest form. The chocolate box arrived on a Tuesday in November, when the first real cold snap was making my joints ache worse than usual. I'd been complaining about the arthritis pain during one of my increasingly rare phone conversations with David, mentioning that I couldn't afford the good anti-inflammatory medicine anymore, that I was making do with generic aspirin that barely helped. "Maybe you should try some vitamins, Mom. Natural supplements might help." It was the most concerned he'd sounded about my health in months, the most engaged he'd been in any conversation we'd had. So when the box arrived with "For Mom's Health" written in his familiar handwriting, I felt a flutter of hope that maybe he did still care. Maybe he was thinking about me after all. The chocolates were beautiful, dark and glossy in their elegant box. The kind I used to buy for myself when I worked at Macy's during the Christmas season and got an employee discount. But it was the vitamin bottles that made my heart swell. 2 different supplements, with professional-looking labels and descriptions that matched exactly what I'd told him about my joint pain and fatigue. I called him that evening to thank him. "David, honey, the vitamins came today. That was so thoughtful of you." There was a pause, like he'd forgotten what I was talking about. "Oh, yeah. The vitamins. Good. Hope they help." His voice was distracted, distant. I could hear Sarah in the background talking about dinner reservations, about someone named Jennifer who was having a party. "Should I take them with food?" I asked, trying to extend the conversation, to hold on to this moment of his attention. "Whatever, Mom. Just follow the directions on the bottle." Another pause. "Look, I've got to go. We're meeting friends for dinner." The line went dead before I could say goodbye. But still, I was grateful. He'd thought of me, spent money on me, tried to help with my pain. That first night, I took the vitamins with dinner, washing down the brown capsules with water and ignoring the metallic aftertaste. This was love, wasn't it? This was David showing care in the only way he knew how. The side effects started almost immediately. My hands shook worse than usual, making it hard to hold my coffee mug without spilling. My stomach burned, especially in the mornings, like I'd swallowed acid. I felt dizzy when I stood up, had to grip the countertop until the world stopped spinning. I told myself these were normal reactions, that my body needed time to adjust to the supplements. Mrs. Ramirez, my neighbor from downstairs, noticed I looked pale when she encountered me in the mailbox area. "Mija, you okay? You look sick." "Just tired," I said, though it was more than tiredness. It was a bone-deep weakness, a feeling like my body was slowly shutting down. "My son sent me some vitamins to help with my arthritis. Maybe they're just strong. Mrs. Ramirez frowned. She was a retired nurse, had worked at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital for 30 years before her back gave out. What kind of vitamins? You should check with your doctor before taking new supplements, especially if you're feeling worse. But I didn't want to check with my doctor. I wanted to believe that David cared enough to research the right supplements for me, that he'd spent time thinking about my health and comfort. I wanted this to be the beginning of him caring again, of us finding our way back to each other. So I kept taking them, even as my symptoms got worse. Even as I started having trouble walking to the corner store without getting winded. Even as my vision became blurry and my thoughts seemed cloudy, like I was thinking through thick fog. It was Clara who made me realize something was seriously wrong. She was visiting one Sunday afternoon, one of those rare occasions when David and Sarah brought her by for an hour or two. I was sitting in my armchair, trying to focus on a picture book we were reading together, when the words started swimming on the page. "Grandma, are you okay?" Clara asked, her small hand touching my knee. "Your hands are shaky." I looked down and saw that my hands were trembling badly, the book shaking in my grip. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." But Clara looked worried, her 4-year-old face creased with concern that shouldn't belong to someone so young. "Maybe you should see a doctor, Grandma. That's what Mommy says when I don't feel good." Sarah overheard and came into the living room, her expression shifting from polite indifference to concern. Not concern for me exactly, but concern that something might be wrong in front of Clara. "Are you feeling all right? You look very pale." I wanted to tell her about the vitamins, about how I'd been feeling worse since I started taking them. But I also didn't want to complain about David's gift, didn't want to seem ungrateful for the one gesture of care he'd shown me in months. "I'm fine, just adjusting to some new supplements." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "What kind of supplements? David didn't mention anything about sending you vitamins." The words hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't mentioned it, not to his wife, not to the mother of his child, not to the person who shared his bed and his thoughts and his plans for the future. Had he forgotten already? Or was there another reason he hadn't told Sarah about his thoughtful gift to his mother? I mumbled something about joint supplements and changed the subject, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, after they left, I stared at the vitamin bottles on my kitchen counter with new eyes. The labels looked professional, but when I examined them closely, there was no company name, no address, no FDA statement. The pills inside rattled loosely, and the smell when I opened the bottles was sharp and chemical. Nothing like the earthy scent of the vitamins I'd taken in the past. But I still didn't want to believe what my gut was telling me. David might be distant, might be selfish, might have forgotten the mother who'd sacrificed everything for his success. But he wouldn't hurt me. Would he? The doubt ate at me for days. I stopped taking the vitamins but didn't throw them away, keeping them on the counter like evidence I wasn't ready to examine. My symptoms began to improve almost immediately. The shaking in my hands decreased. The burning in my stomach subsided. My vision cleared, and my thoughts felt sharper than they had in weeks. It was Mrs. Ramirez who finally pushed me to seek answers. She knocked on my door one evening with a pot of rice and beans. The kind of gesture that reminded me there was still kindness in the world. "You look better," she observed, settling into my wobbly chair with familiar ease. "Less gray in your face." "I stopped taking those vitamins," I admitted. "I was having some side effects." She looked at the bottles sitting on my counter, picked one up, and examined the label with her trained nurse's eye. "This doesn't look right," she said slowly. "No manufacturer information, no batch numbers. These could be anything." "My son sent them," I said weakly. "He wanted to help with my arthritis." Mrs. Ramirez gave me a long look, the kind that sees through excuses and self-deception. "Mija, when something doesn't feel right, you have to trust your instincts, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. David had been so distant lately, so cold. Our last phone conversation had been about money, about another investment opportunity he needed help financing. When I'd told him I couldn't mortgage my apartment again, that I had nothing left to give, his voice had turned sharp and angry. "Fine, Mom. I guess I know where I stand with you." He'd hung up without saying goodbye, and I hadn't heard from him since. Then, a week later, the vitamins had arrived. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would do. I gathered the vitamin bottles and took the subway to Manhattan to a private lab I'd found online. The technician was young and kind, maybe Clara's age if Clara were grown up. She didn't ask questions when I explained I wanted the capsules tested, just nodded professionally and explained the process. "We can test for heavy metals, toxins, pharmaceutical compounds," she said. "What are you concerned about?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "That's what scares me." The wait for results was the longest 5 days of my life. I tried to go about my normal routine, but nothing felt normal. Every time my phone rang, I hoped it was David calling to check on me, to ask how the vitamins were working, to prove that he'd sent them out of love and concern. But the phone stayed mostly silent except for credit card companies calling about overdue payments. When the lab called, I was sitting at my kitchen table eating a lunch of crackers and peanut butter, trying to make groceries last until my next Social Security check. "Ms. Henderson, we have your test results. Can you come in today to discuss them?" The tone of the technician's voice told me everything I needed to know. You don't ask someone to come in urgently to discuss good news. At the lab, the same young woman who'd taken my samples sat across from me with a folder full of papers and the expression of barely contained shock. "Ms. Henderson, I have to ask, where did you get these capsules?" "My son sent them," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She opened the folder and showed me charts and graphs that might as well have been written in a foreign language. These capsules contain dangerously high levels of heavy metals: lead, mercury, cadmium, also several industrial chemicals that shouldn't be in any kind of supplement. If you'd continued taking them regularly, you could have suffered permanent organ damage or worse. The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the chair to keep from falling over. "Are you sure? Could there have been some kind of mistake?" "We ran the tests twice to be certain. Ms. Henderson, these aren't vitamins. I don't know what they are, but they're toxic, potentially lethal in the right concentrations." I don't remember the subway ride home. I don't remember climbing the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. I don't remember sitting down at my kitchen table, but I remember the moment when the full weight of what she'd said hit me like a physical blow. My son had sent me poison, not by accident, not because of some manufacturing error or mislabeled bottles. Those capsules had been deliberately filled with substances that would slowly kill me if I kept taking them. The chocolates had been a cover, a way to make the package seem like a gift instead of what it really was. I sat at that wobbly table where David had done his homework as a boy, where we'd shared so many meals and conversations and dreams, and tried to understand how we'd gotten to this point. How the child I'd carried in my body, fed with my milk, loved with every fiber of my being, could want me dead. The answer came in pieces, like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. David had become wealthy, wealthier than I'd ever imagined possible. His investments in cryptocurrency and tech stocks had paid off spectacularly. But I knew from our conversations over the years that he lived beyond even his substantial means, that he was always looking for the next big opportunity, the next chance to multiply his fortune. I also knew that I was one of the few people who understood exactly how much money he owed me. Tens of thousands of dollars I'd lent him over the years, money I'd borrowed against my own future to fund his dreams. Money he'd never repaid despite repeated promises, despite his obvious ability to do so. Maybe I was a liability now. Maybe my poverty was embarrassing to him in his new life with Sarah and her wealthy family. Maybe the thought of supporting me in my old age was more than he wanted to bear. Maybe it was simply easier to be rid of me than to acknowledge what he owed me, both financially and emotionally. Or maybe it was something simpler and more chilling. Maybe he'd calculated that my death would solve several problems at once. No more requests for repayment. No more embarrassment about his poor mother. And possibly, if I hadn't made a will yet, inheritance money he could use for his next big investment. I sat there until the sun set behind the buildings across the street. Until Mrs. Chen finished hanging her laundry. Until the sounds of evening traffic began outside my window. I sat there holding those test results and trying to figure out what to do with the most devastating knowledge of my life. I could call the police, but what would I tell them? That my son had sent me vitamins that turned out to be toxic. They would ask for proof of intent, and I had none. David was too smart to leave evidence, too careful to be caught so easily. He would claim ignorance, would say he'd bought the supplements from some online retailer and had no idea they were contaminated. He would play the concerned son, horrified that his attempt to help his mother had gone so wrong. I could confront him directly, but what would that accomplish? If he was capable of trying to poison me, he was certainly capable of lying about it, of making me question my own sanity, of turning the accusation back on me. I could already hear his voice. "Mom, you're being paranoid. Why would you think I would hurt you? Maybe you should see someone about these delusions." But I couldn't do nothing. I couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. Couldn't go back to our strained relationship knowing what I now knew. The vitamins were still sitting on my counter, evidence of a betrayal so deep I could barely comprehend it. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not to ask for anything, not to beg for better circumstances. I prayed for clarity, for strength, for the wisdom to know how to move forward. I prayed for the courage to face the truth about my son and about myself, about the choices I'd made that had led us to this moment. When I woke up the next morning, I knew what I had to do. I've spent my entire adult life making excuses for David, explaining away his selfishness, his coldness, his increasing cruelty as symptoms of stress or immaturity, or the pressures of his ambitious life. I've told myself that underneath it all, he was still the little boy who used to save me cookies from his lunch, who used to make me tea when I came home exhausted from work. But that little boy was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all except in my desperate imagination. The man who had sent me those vitamins was a stranger wearing my son's face, someone capable of calculated murder disguised as a gift. I needed to accept that reality before I could figure out how to survive it. The next few days passed in a strange kind of calm. I went about my routine, grocery shopping, laundry, the ordinary tasks of staying alive. But everything felt different now. I saw my small apartment with new eyes, not as a place of poverty and limitation, but as a refuge, a space that belonged to me and me alone. I noticed things I'd overlooked before, the way morning light fell across my kitchen table, the sounds of children playing in the courtyard below, the smell of Mrs. Chen's cooking drifting through the thin walls. These were the details of a life I'd almost lost, simplicities I'd almost been prevented from experiencing. David had wanted to erase me from the world, but instead he'd shown me how precious my existence was, how much I valued the privilege of being alive. On Friday morning, my phone rang. David's number appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I needed to hear his voice, needed to listen for signs of guilt or concern or any evidence that he cared about the effect his gift had had on me. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. How are you feeling?" His tone was casual, almost bored. "I'm fine, David. Thank you for asking." I kept my voice steady, neutral. "Good, good. And the vitamins? Are they helping with your arthritis?" There it was. The question I'd been waiting for. The moment of truth. If he'd sent them innocently, if there had been some terrible mistake, he would have asked about side effects, would have wanted to know details about my experience with them. Instead, he asked if they were helping, as if he expected them to solve my problems permanently. I stopped taking them, I said. They were making me feel worse. A pause. Worse how? Dizzy, nauseous, shaky hands. I listed the symptoms I'd experienced, waiting for his reaction. That's weird. Maybe you should try taking them with food instead of on an empty stomach. There was no concern in his voice, no suggestion that I see a doctor, no offer to replace them with something different. Just a casual recommendation to continue ingesting the toxins he'd sent me. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that he'd meant for those vitamins to hurt me. Actually, I said, I had them tested at a lab. They contained heavy metals and industrial chemicals. The technician said they could have caused permanent organ damage if I'd kept taking them. The silence that followed stretched for so long I thought the call might have been dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice was different, cooler. That's ridiculous, Mom. I ordered those from a reputable supplier. Maybe the lab made a mistake, or maybe you got the bottles mixed up with something else. He was lying. I could hear it now, could recognize the subtle shift in his tone that I'd missed or ignored so many times before. This was the voice he used when he was calculating, when he was trying to manage a situation rather than respond honestly to it. I'm sure the lab was thorough, I said. I wanted to let you know in case others had ordered from the same supplier. Right. Well, I'll look into it. Hey, Mom, I've got to run. Sarah's calling about something with Clara. We'll talk later. He hung up without saying goodbye, without asking if I was okay, without expressing any relief that I hadn't been seriously harmed by the toxic supplements he'd sent me. If there had been any doubt left in my mind, that conversation erased it completely. David had tried to kill me, and when his plan failed, his primary concern was managing the situation to protect himself. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to me just weeks before. I called my bank and asked to speak to someone about changing my account information. I called the Social Security office and asked about direct deposit security. I called my credit card companies and put fraud alerts on my accounts. I was taking control of my finances, protecting myself from further exploitation. If David was capable of trying to poison me, he was certainly capable of stealing from me more directly. I couldn't prove he'd been forging checks or using my credit cards without permission, but I could make sure it didn't happen again. The bank representative was patient and professional, walking me through the steps to secure my accounts. Are you concerned about identity theft, Mrs. Henderson? Something like that, I said. I want to make sure no one can access my money without my explicit permission. Have you considered changing your emergency contacts as well? Sometimes family members or friends with account access can become problems if relationships change. I thought about David's name on my emergency contact forms, his access to information about my finances and medical care. Another vulnerability I'd never considered, another way he could hurt me if he chose to. Yes, I said. I'd like to change all of that. When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of agency over my own life. For decades, I'd been reactive, responding to David's needs and demands and crises. Now, I was taking proactive steps to protect myself, making decisions based on my own well-being rather than his convenience. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. That weekend, I did something else that would have been unthinkable before. I went to see a lawyer, not a fancy Manhattan attorney in an expensive suit, but a community legal aid lawyer who worked with seniors and low-income residents. Her office was in a converted brownstone in Park Slope, and the waiting room smelled like coffee and looked like someone's grandmother's living room. Jennifer Martinez was younger than David but older than Clara, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense way of speaking. She listened while I told her about the vitamins, about the lab tests, about my suspicions regarding David's intentions. Do you want to press charges? She asked when I'd finished. I thought about it, about the drama and publicity and family destruction that would follow. About Clara growing up knowing her father had tried to kill her grandmother. About Sarah and Patricia and the whole complicated web of relationships that would be torn apart. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I want to be safe. I want to protect myself. But I don't know if I want to destroy what's left of my family." Jennifer nodded, understanding. "We can take steps to protect you legally without necessarily pursuing criminal charges. We can document what happened, get restraining orders if necessary, make sure your will and medical directives exclude anyone who might not have your best interests at heart." Over the next hour, she helped me understand my options. I could change my will, removing David as beneficiary and executor. I could update my medical power of attorney, ensuring he would have no say in my care if I became incapacitated. I could document the vitamin incident officially, creating a legal record without filing charges. "Mrs. Henderson," Jennifer said as our meeting ended, "you don't have to decide everything today, but you should know that what your son did, if your suspicions are correct, is attempted murder. At minimum, it's elder abuse. You have rights, and you have options." Walking home from her office, I felt something shifting inside me. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was thinking about my future in terms of what I wanted rather than what David needed. I was considering my own well-being as a priority rather than an afterthought. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. That evening, I called Mrs. Ramirez and asked if she wanted to have dinner together. Not because I needed something, not because I was in crisis, but simply because I enjoyed her company and wanted to share a meal with someone who treated me with kindness and respect. We cooked together in my small kitchen, her bringing seasonings and techniques that made my simple ingredients taste like celebration. We talked about our children, about the weather, about the changes in the neighborhood over the years. But mostly, we talked about ourselves, about our dreams and disappointments, about the women we'd been and the women we were becoming. "You seem different," Mrs. Ramirez observed as we cleaned dishes together. "Stronger, somehow." "I'm learning to take care of myself," I said. "It's harder than I thought it would be, but also easier." She laughed, a sound full of understanding. "I know what you mean. When my son moved to California and stopped calling, I cried for months. I thought my life was over. But then I started doing things I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I learned to paint. I joined a book club. I discovered I liked being alone with my own thoughts." "Do you miss him?" I asked. "Every day. But I don't miss feeling worthless. Feeling like I only mattered when he needed something. I love him, but I love myself too now. Both things can be true." That night, I slept better than I had in months. No nightmares about David, no anxiety about money or family obligations. Just deep, peaceful sleep in my own bed, in my own space, surrounded by the small comforts I'd built for myself over the years. When I woke up the next morning, I had a text message from Clara. It was a photo of a drawing she'd made, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. The text said, "I miss you, Grandma. When can I see you again?" My heart filled with both joy and sadness. Clara was innocent in all this, a child who loved me simply and purely. But she was also David's daughter, part of his family system, subject to his control and Sarah's influence. Seeing her would mean dealing with them, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that yet. But I wasn't ready to give up on her either. Clara represented the best of what family could be. Love without conditions, joy without hidden costs, connection without manipulation. I texted back, "I miss you too, sweetheart. We'll see each other soon. I love you." It was a promise to her and to myself. Whatever happened with David, whatever choices I made about my own safety and well-being, I wouldn't abandon the one person in his family who saw me as I truly was. The next few weeks passed quietly. David didn't call to ask about my health or check on my reaction to the vitamin incident. Sarah didn't text with photos or updates about Clara. The silence was telling, confirmation that they were waiting to see if his plan had worked, if I would simply fade away without making trouble for them. But instead of fading, I was growing stronger. I started taking walks around the neighborhood, really seeing it for the first time in years. I discovered a community garden where volunteers tended plots of vegetables and flowers, a small oasis of green in the urban landscape. I introduced myself to the coordinator and asked if there were plots available. "We have a waiting list," she said, "but we also have volunteer opportunities if you're interested in helping out." I spent my first morning there weeding tomato plants and picking herbs, working alongside people of all ages who were passionate about growing things, about nurturing life from soil and seeds. My hands remembered skills I'd forgotten I had, knowledge passed down from my grandmother who had kept a garden behind her Philadelphia row house decades ago. "You're a natural," said Roberto, the garden coordinator. "Have you grown vegetables before?" "A long time ago," I said, surprised by how good it felt to dig in the earth, to work with my hands toward something beautiful and productive. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it. By the end of the morning, I'd signed up to volunteer twice a week. It wasn't just about the gardening, though I loved that. It was about being part of something larger than myself, contributing to beauty and nourishment in the world rather than just surviving from day to day. On my way home, I stopped at the library and checked out books about container gardening and urban farming. If I couldn't have a plot in the community garden right away, I could at least grow herbs on my fire escape, could bring life and color into my small space. That evening, I rearranged my living room, moving furniture to let more light reach the windows. I cleaned surfaces I hadn't touched in months, threw away old magazines and papers that had been accumulating like sediment over the years of depression and defeat. My apartment began to feel less like a place I was trapped and more like a home I was creating. The changes were small but significant. I bought fresh flowers at the corner market, just a small bunch of daisies that brightened my kitchen table. I started cooking real meals again instead of subsisting on crackers and peanut butter, rediscovering the pleasure of feeding myself well. I called old friends I'd lost touch with during the years when David's demands consumed all my emotional energy. One of those friends was Patricia, not David's mother-in-law, but my own Patricia, a woman I'd worked with at Macy's 20 years ago. We'd been close once, meeting for coffee and sharing stories about our children and our dreams. But as David's needs became more consuming, as my financial situation grew more desperate, I'd withdrawn from friendships that reminded me of who I used to be. "Angela!" Patricia sounded genuinely delighted to hear from me. "I was just thinking about you last week. How are you?" We talked for an hour, catching up on children and grandchildren, health and retirement plans, the ordinary details of lives lived over decades. Patricia was retired now, living comfortably on her pension and Social Security, taking art classes and volunteering at a literacy program. Her daughter lived nearby with 2 teenagers who visited regularly and called their grandmother just to chat. "You sound different," Patricia said toward the end of our conversation. "Happy. I haven't heard you sound happy in years." "I'm learning to be happy," I said. "It's a skill I'd forgotten I had." "We should meet for lunch," she suggested. "I'd love to see you, to hear more about what you've been up to." We made plans to meet the following week at a diner in Queens, neutral territory where we could talk without the weight of my current circumstances hanging over us. After I hung up, I realized I was looking forward to it, anticipating reconnecting with someone who remembered me as more than just David's mother or a source of financial support. This was what recovery looked like, I was beginning to understand. Not dramatic gestures or complete transformations, but small daily choices to prioritize my own well-being, to seek out connection and beauty and purpose. It was the accumulation of moments when I chose myself instead of choosing to diminish myself for someone else's comfort. But even as I was rediscovering my own strength, I knew the situation with David wasn't resolved. He would eventually contact me again, if only to see whether his plan had succeeded. And when that happened, I would need to be ready with more than just personal empowerment. I would need to be ready to confront him with the truth and to protect myself from further harm. The call came on a Thursday morning in early December. I was drinking coffee and reading about organic pest control for container gardens when my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking those moments to center myself and remember my strength. "Hi, David." "Mom, how are you feeling? Any better?" His voice was casual, almost cheerful, the voice of someone who expected good news. "Much better, thank you. I've stopped taking those vitamins completely, and all my symptoms have cleared up." "Oh." A pause. "That's good. I'm glad you're feeling better." He didn't sound glad. He sounded confused, maybe disappointed. The tone was subtle, but I'd learned to listen for subtleties in David's voice, to hear what he wasn't saying as clearly as what he was. "David," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." "Okay. Where exactly did you buy those vitamins? I'd like to report the contamination to the appropriate authorities so other people don't get hurt." Another long pause. I could almost hear him thinking, calculating his response. "You know, Mom, I'm not sure I remember. I order a lot of stuff online. Maybe Amazon? Or one of those health food sites. I'll have to check my email receipts." It was a reasonable response, the kind of answer an innocent person might give. But there was something rehearsed about it, too polished for someone who was genuinely trying to remember where they'd made a purchase. "That would be helpful," I said. The lab technician said the contamination was severe enough that it should be reported to the FDA. Heavy metals and industrial chemicals aren't the kind of thing that accidentally ends up in vitamin capsules. "The lab technician?" David's voice sharpened slightly. "You mean you actually had them tested?" "Of course I did. When supplements make you violently ill, you find out why." I kept my tone matter of fact, as if this was the most natural response in the world. "Right, of course." That was smart. But he didn't sound like he thought it was smart. He sounded like he thought it was problematic. "I'll email you the lab results," I said. "That way you'll have the technical details to include in your complaint to whoever you bought them from." "No." The response was too quick, too sharp. "I mean, that's not necessary. I'll handle it on my end." And there it was, the confirmation I'd been waiting for. An innocent person would want to see those lab results, would be horrified by the evidence of contamination, would be eager to pursue every avenue to prevent others from being harmed. David didn't want to see the evidence because he already knew what it would show. "All right," I said calmly. "But if you change your mind, just let me know." We talked for a few more minutes about surface things, the weather, Clara's school activities, his work projects. But the subtext was clear to both of us now. I knew what he'd done. He knew that I knew. And we were both trying to figure out what came next. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen holding the phone and marveling at how calm I felt. 6 months ago, this conversation would have devastated me, would have sent me spiraling into doubt and self-blame and desperate attempts to preserve our relationship at any cost. Now I felt sad, but not surprised, hurt, but not shattered. The difference was that I no longer needed David to validate my worth or confirm my reality. I knew who I was independent of his opinion of me. I knew what had happened independent of his willingness to acknowledge it. And I knew what I needed to do to protect myself, regardless of what it might cost our relationship. That afternoon, I called Jennifer Martinez and scheduled another appointment. It was time to take the next steps in protecting myself legally and financially. Whatever confrontation with David lay ahead, I wanted to be prepared for it. The holiday season was approaching, and with it the traditional expectations of family gatherings and forced cheerfulness. In past years, I'd spent Thanksgiving and Christmas walking on eggshells, trying to navigate David's moods and Sarah's subtle hostility. while cherishing whatever moments I could steal with Clara. The holidays had become exercises in endurance rather than celebration. This year would be different. This year, I had choices. When Sarah called in mid-December to discuss Christmas plans, her voice carried the familiar undertone of polite obligation. "We thought we'd host Christmas dinner this year. Nothing fancy, just family. Can you make it to Westchester on Christmas Day?" In the past, I would have said yes immediately, grateful to be included regardless of how unwelcome I felt once I arrived. This year, I found myself actually considering whether I wanted to spend Christmas with people who saw me as a burden at best, a target at worst. "Let me check my schedule and get back to you," I said. Sarah sounded surprised. "Your schedule? Don't you usually spend Christmas alone?" The question stung, but it also revealed something important. Sarah assumed I had no life outside of waiting for invitations from David's family. No friends or activities or commitments that might conflict with their plans. She saw me as pathetic and isolated, someone who would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they offered. "Actually, I've been quite busy lately," I said. "I'm volunteering at a community garden, and I've reconnected with some old friends. The holiday season has been fuller than usual." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I had plans with Patricia for New Year's Eve, was volunteering extra hours at the garden's holiday fundraiser, had accepted Mrs. Ramirez's invitation to attend Christmas Eve Mass with her family. My calendar wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. "Oh," Sarah said, clearly not sure how to respond. "Well, let us know when you decide. We need to plan the seating and meal portions." After she hung up, I realized I was smiling. For the first time in years, I had leverage in family negotiations. They wanted something from me. My presence. My participation in their fantasy of normal family dynamics. And I had the power to say no. The realization was intoxicating. I spent the next few days actually thinking about what I wanted to do for Christmas. Not what was expected of me, not what would cause the least conflict, but what would bring me joy and peace. The answer, when it came to me, was surprisingly simple. I wanted to spend Christmas morning alone in my apartment, drinking coffee and watching old movies. I wanted to cook a small meal for myself, something I enjoyed rather than something designed to impress others. I wanted to call Clara and wish her a happy holiday without having to navigate the tension and resentment of being in the same room as her parents. And I wanted to visit the community garden in the afternoon, to check on the winter vegetables and maybe bring flowers to the small memorial corner where volunteers remembered neighbors who had passed away. It would be quiet and peaceful, a celebration of life and growth rather than obligation and performance. When I called Sarah back, my voice was steady and clear. "Thank you for the invitation, but I won't be able to make it to Christmas dinner. I have other commitments." The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp with poorly disguised annoyance. "Other commitments? What kind of commitments?" "Personal ones," I said, offering no further explanation. "David isn't going to be happy about this. He was looking forward to seeing you." It was a lie, and we both knew it. David hadn't expressed any enthusiasm about seeing me in months. If anything, my presence at family gatherings seemed to irritate him, a reminder of obligations and history he preferred to forget. "I'm sorry to disappoint him," I said, though I wasn't sorry at all. "Maybe we can arrange a visit another time." After I hung up, I felt a rush of emotions. Pride in standing up for myself. Excitement about spending the holiday on my own terms. And yes, sadness about the family connections I was choosing to sacrifice for my own well-being. But the sadness felt clean somehow, honest grief for something that had been lost long ago rather than desperate clinging to something that had never really existed. Christmas morning was everything I'd hoped it would be. I woke up naturally, without an alarm, and made coffee in my favorite mug, the cracked one that cut my finger sometimes, but had been with me through so many mornings over the years. I watched White Christmas on my small television, remembering how my mother used to cry during the final scene when the characters found their way back to each other. I cooked myself a small turkey breast and real mashed potatoes, the kind that take forever to peel and prepare but taste nothing like the instant version I'd been subsisting on. I set my table with my good plates, the ones I'd been saving for company that never came, and ate slowly, savoring every bite. Around noon, Clara called. Her voice was bright with excitement about her presence and her day, but I could hear questions underneath her chatter. "Grandma, why didn't you come to Christmas dinner? Daddy said you were busy, but I missed you." My heart clenched. This was the hardest part of protecting myself, knowing that my choices affected Clara even though she was innocent of her parents' cruelty. "I missed you too, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions, but that doesn't mean I love you any less. Can I see you soon? Maybe for my birthday next month?" "We'll see, Clara. I hope so." After we hung up, I allowed myself to cry. Not the desperate, overwhelmed tears of the past months, but clean grief for the relationship with my granddaughter that was being damaged by her father's actions and my need to protect myself. But even in my sadness, I knew I'd made the right choice. I was learning that love sometimes requires boundaries, that protecting yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is being destroyed. That afternoon, I walked to the community garden. It was quiet and beautiful in the winter light, the bare trees creating delicate patterns against the gray sky. I brought a small bouquet to the memorial corner and spent a few minutes thinking about Mrs. Henderson from upstairs, who had died the previous spring and used to share vegetables from her garden plot with anyone who wanted them. "Thank you," I whispered, though I wasn't sure exactly what I was thanking her for. Maybe for the reminder that life was finite and precious, that every day above ground was a gift I shouldn't waste on people who wished I were underground. As I walked home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment. Not wild happiness, not the absence of all problems, but a deep sense of being exactly where I belonged, living in alignment with my own values and needs. It was the best Christmas I'd had in decades. The new year brought new challenges and new revelations. David called on New Year's Day, ostensibly to wish me Happy New Year, but actually to guilt me about missing Christmas dinner. "Sarah was really hurt that you didn't come," he said. "She went to a lot of trouble planning the meal." "I'm sure she did," I said evenly. "I hope it was lovely." "Mom, what's going on with you lately? You seem different, distant." There it was, the opening I'd been waiting for. David had given me the perfect opportunity to address what had happened between us, to confront him about the vitamins and his attempt to harm me. 6 months ago, I would have backed down, would have found excuses to avoid the confrontation. But I wasn't the same person I'd been 6 months ago. "David, I think we need to have an honest conversation about our relationship, about the vitamins you sent me, and about what you were hoping they would accomplish." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him calculating his options, trying to decide whether to continue lying or shift to a different strategy. "I don't know what you mean," he said finally. "I sent you vitamins to help with your arthritis. I'm sorry they didn't agree with you, but I don't understand what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, David. I'm stating directly that the capsules you sent me contained heavy metals and industrial chemicals that could have killed me if I'd continued taking them. The lab results were very clear about that." "Lab results?" His voice was tight now, controlled. "Mom, I think you may be overreacting to—" "I'm not overreacting," I interrupted. "I'm responding appropriately to an attempt on my life. And I want to know why. What did you hope to gain from my death?" The words hung in the air between us. Once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. We had crossed a line from subtext to direct confrontation, from suspicion to accusation. "That's crazy, Mom. Why would I want to hurt you? You're my mother." "I don't know why, David. That's what I'm asking you. Is it the money you owe me? Is it embarrassment about my financial situation? Is it simply easier to inherit whatever little I have than to support me as I age? I can't believe we're having this conversation. You're talking like I'm some kind of criminal, like I'm capable of murder. I love you, Mom. I would never hurt you. But even as he said the words, his tone betrayed him. There was no shock in his voice, no genuine horror at being accused of attempted murder. There was only calculation, the sound of someone trying to manage a difficult situation rather than respond to a devastating misunderstanding. If you love me, I said, then prove it. Show me the receipt for where you bought those vitamins. Give me the name of the company so I can follow up on the contamination. Help me understand how this happened if it was truly an accident. I don't have that information anymore. I delete most of my email receipts to keep my inbox clean. It was a weak lie, and he knew it. In an age when everything is digital and searchable, when Amazon keeps purchase histories for years, claiming to have no record of a recent purchase was implausible. David, I said quietly, I know you tried to poison me. I know it wasn't an accident. What I don't know is why, or what you plan to do now that it didn't work. The admission sat between us like a stone thrown into still water, ripples spreading outward to disturb everything we'd carefully avoided acknowledging. If that's what you really believe, David said finally, then I guess we don't have anything more to talk about. I guess we don't. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in my kitchen holding the phone and feeling strangely liberated. The pretense was over. The careful dance around difficult truths was finished. We both knew where we stood now. That evening, I called Jennifer Martinez and scheduled an emergency appointment for the next morning. It was time to take concrete legal steps to protect myself, regardless of what it might cost in terms of family relationships. Jennifer listened to my account of the phone call with professional interest and personal concern. Mrs. Henderson, what your son just did is essentially a confession. When confronted with evidence of wrongdoing, an innocent person expresses shock and horror. They demand to see the evidence. They insist on investigating how such a thing could have happened. Your son did none of those things. So what do I do now? That depends on what outcome you want. If you want him prosecuted, we can take the evidence to the district attorney. If you want protection without necessarily destroying him, we can pursue restraining orders and other legal safeguards. If you want to handle this privately, we can help you document everything for your own protection. I thought about Clara, about the family destruction that would follow if I pursued criminal charges. I thought about David's wealthy lifestyle, about how skilled lawyers would probably find ways to create reasonable doubt about his intentions. I thought about my own energy and resources, about whether I wanted to spend my remaining years fighting legal battles. I want protection, I said finally. I want to make sure he can never hurt me again, but I don't necessarily want to destroy his life. Jennifer nodded, understanding. We can work with that. Let's start by updating your will and medical directives, removing David from any position of authority over your affairs. We'll also set up legal documentation of this incident, so if anything happens to you in the future, investigators will know where to look. Over the next several weeks, I systematically removed David from every aspect of my legal and financial life. New will, new medical power of attorney, new emergency contacts, new beneficiaries for my accounts and insurance policies. I added Patricia as my healthcare proxy, and Mrs. Ramirez as an emergency contact, people who actually cared about my well-being and could be trusted to act in my best interests. The changes felt both empowering and heartbreaking. I was protecting my future, but I was also acknowledging that my son was a threat to me rather than a source of support. It was like performing surgery on my own heart, cutting away diseased tissue to save what remained healthy. Meanwhile, David made no attempt to contact me. No apologies, no explanations, no efforts to repair what had been broken between us. The silence was telling. If he had been innocent, if the vitamins had been contaminated by accident, He would have been desperate to clear up the misunderstanding, to prove his love and concern for my welfare. Instead, he simply waited, perhaps hoping I would forget, would convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, would return to our old dynamic of pretending problems didn't exist for the sake of maintaining family peace. But I wasn't going to forget, and I wasn't going to pretend anymore. In February, Sarah called. Her voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone who had been coached on what to say. "Angela, David is concerned about you. He thinks you may be having some health issues, maybe memory problems or confusion. He's wondering if you should see a doctor." It was a clever strategy, I had to admit. By suggesting I was mentally incompetent, they could discredit anything I might say about David's attempt to poison me. If I told anyone about the vitamins, they could claim it was the delusion of an unstable elderly woman. "I appreciate his concern," I said, "but my health is fine. In fact, I've felt better in the past few months than I have in years. Amazing what happens when you stop taking toxic supplements." Sarah's pause was telling. "Toxic supplements? Has David not told you about the vitamins he sent me? About how they contained heavy metals and industrial chemicals? I'm surprised he wouldn't share something so concerning with his wife. What are you talking about?" And there it was. David hadn't told Sarah what he'd done, either because he wanted to protect her from knowledge that would implicate her in his crime, or because he knew she would disapprove and try to stop him. Either way, her genuine confusion confirmed that David had been acting independently. "Perhaps you should ask David about it," I said. "I think you'll find it very educational." That evening, David called. His voice was furious in a way I'd rarely heard, barely controlled rage that made my hands shake despite my newfound strength. "What the hell did you say to Sarah? She's asking all kinds of crazy questions about vitamins and labs and poison. You're trying to destroy my marriage with your paranoid nonsense." "I told her the truth, David, that you sent me supplements that nearly killed me, and that when I confronted you about it, you showed no surprise or concern. I suggested she ask you for your version of events." "My version? There's only one version, and it's that you've lost your mind. You're a sad, lonely old woman who's so desperate for attention that you're making up stories about your own son trying to hurt you." The words were designed to hurt, to make me doubt myself, to push me back into the role of grateful victim who accepted whatever treatment she received without complaint. 6 months ago, they might have worked. "David," I said calmly, "if I'm so wrong about what happened, then prove it. Show Sarah the receipts for the vitamins. Show her the company information so she can verify that contaminated products are a known problem. Help her understand how an innocent mistake nearly killed your mother. I don't have to prove anything to you or to anyone else. You're nobody. You're a broke old woman living in a falling-down apartment. And if it weren't for my generosity over the years, you'd be homeless." "Your generosity?" I laughed, and the sound surprised us both. "David, I've given you tens of thousands of dollars over the years. I mortgaged my home to fund your dreams. I sacrificed my own retirement security to support your lifestyle. If anyone has been generous, it's been me. That was your choice. I never forced you to do anything. You're right, it was my choice, and now I'm making different choices. I'm choosing to protect myself from people who would harm me, even if those people happen to be my own family. You're choosing to be alone. You're choosing to lose the only people who care about you. David," I said gently, "you don't care about me. If you cared about me, you wouldn't have tried to poison me. You would have visited when I was sick, called on my birthday, included me in family events because you wanted my company rather than because you felt obligated. People who care about you don't try to kill you, even slowly, even subtly." The truth hung between us, simple and undeniable. "I'm done with this conversation," David said, "and I'm done with you. Don't call me anymore. Don't contact my family. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a mother." The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone and waiting to feel devastated. waiting for the crushing grief that should follow being disowned by your only child, waiting for the regret that should come with pushing away the last connection to the family I'd built and sacrificed for. But what I felt was relief. The uncertainty was over. The pretense was finished. David had finally stated explicitly what had been implicit for years. Our relationship was transactional, and when I stopped providing value to him, he was willing to discard me completely. It hurt, but it was a clean hurt. Like pulling off a bandage that had been covering a wound for too long, allowing air and light to finally reach damaged tissue so it could begin to heal properly. That night, I called Mrs. Ramirez and asked if she wanted to come up for tea. She arrived within minutes, took one look at my face, and wrapped me in the kind of hug I hadn't received in years. "What happened, mija?" I told her about the conversation with David, about his final rejection, about the strange sense of relief I felt underneath the sadness. "You know what this means?" she said when I finished. "It means you're free. Free to build a life based on love instead of fear, on respect instead of exploitation. Your son, he gave you a gift, even though he didn't mean to." A gift? Permission to stop trying to earn love from someone who's incapable of giving it. Permission to find people who will love you for who you are instead of what you can provide. That's a precious gift, even if it comes wrapped in pain. As spring arrived, I discovered she was right. Without the constant drain of David's demands and manipulations, I had energy for other relationships. I deepened my friendship with Patricia, meeting her weekly for coffee and long walks through different neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn. I became more involved at the community garden, eventually earning my own plot where I grew tomatoes and herbs and flowers that I shared with neighbors. I joined a book club at the library, a group of women my age who met monthly to discuss novels and share stories from our own lives. I learned that I wasn't the only one who'd struggled with difficult adult children, who'd sacrificed too much for ungrateful family members, who'd made the hard choice to prioritize their own well-being. I started taking a painting class at the senior center, discovering talents I'd never had time to develop when my life revolved around David's needs. My instructor, a retired art teacher named Barbara, encouraged me to enter some of my work in a local art show. The idea seemed ridiculous at first. Me, a 73-year-old woman who'd never painted anything more sophisticated than kitchen cabinets, displaying art for others to judge. But I did it anyway. 3 small canvases featuring flowers from the community garden, simple but honest representations of beauty I'd helped nurture. They didn't win any prizes, but they didn't embarrass me either. More importantly, the act of creating something beautiful, of contributing to the world's store of art and meaning, felt like a form of prayer. For the first time in decades, I was living rather than just surviving. The call about Clara came in May, just as the tomatoes in my garden were starting to flower. It was Sarah, and her voice was different than I'd ever heard it, smaller, more vulnerable, stripped of the polite hostility that had characterized our previous conversations. "Angela, I need to talk to you about Clara, about David." My heart clenched. "Is Clara okay?" She's been asking about you constantly, wanting to know why you don't visit anymore, why you didn't come to her birthday party last month. David tells her you're too busy, that you have other priorities, but she doesn't understand." "What does David tell you?" A long pause. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. After what you said about the vitamins, I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. David's anger when your name comes up. His refusal to explain why you stopped visiting. Some financial documents I found that suggest he's been managing your money in ways that don't make sense." My pulse quickened. "What kind of financial documents?" "Copies of checks from your accounts, mortgage papers with your signature that I don't remember you signing, investment statements showing large transfers from accounts in your name to accounts in his name." The room began to spin. I'd known David had borrowed money from me over the years, but I'd assumed those transactions were straightforward loans, not sophisticated financial theft. "Sarah," I said carefully. How long have you known about this? I suspected something was wrong for a while, but I convinced myself it was none of my business. You and David were adults working out your own financial arrangements. But after you mentioned the vitamins, after I saw how angry he got when I asked about them, I started looking harder. And what did you find? Enough to make me realize that my husband has been systematically stealing from his mother for years, and that when you started asking questions, he decided to solve the problem permanently. She understood. David's wife, the mother of his child, the person who knew him most intimately, had reached the same conclusion I had about his intentions. Sarah, what do you want from me? I want to keep Clara safe. If David is capable of what I think he's capable of, if he really tried to poison his own mother, then what might he do to other people who get in his way? What might he do to me if I threatened to expose him? It was a chilling question, one that opened up possibilities I'd been trying not to consider. If David could attempt to murder his mother for financial gain, what lines wouldn't he cross? How far would he go to protect his lifestyle and reputation? Have you confronted him? Not directly, but he knows I've been asking questions. He's been different lately, watching me more carefully, going through my things. I caught him looking through my phone last week. Sarah, you and Clara need to be somewhere safe while we figure this out. Do you have family you could stay with? My parents are in Connecticut, but if I take Clara there without explanation, David will follow. He'll demand to know what's going on, and I don't know how to tell him I think he's a potential murderer without putting us in danger. We talked for another hour, working out a plan that would protect both Sarah and Clara, while allowing us to document David's crimes and seek justice for what he'd done. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. 3 days later, Sarah called David at work and told him Clara had been in an accident, that they were at the hospital in Connecticut, and he should come immediately. While he was driving north to an emergency that didn't exist, Sarah was meeting me at Jennifer Martinez's office with boxes of financial documents and a recording device. What we discovered over the next several hours was worse than either of us had imagined. David hadn't just borrowed money from me over the years. He'd been forging my signature on loan documents, using my social security number to open credit accounts, systematically stealing my identity to fund his investment schemes. The money I thought I'd freely given him was actually money he'd stolen, often without my knowledge. The vitamin incident wasn't an isolated attempt at murder. It was the culmination of years of financial abuse, David's final solution to the problem of a mother who might eventually discover his crimes. With me dead, there would be no one to question his management of my accounts. He could claim I'd given him power of attorney before my death, could inherit my assets legitimately, could cover up years of theft with a few forged documents. This is elder financial abuse on a massive scale, Jennifer said as we reviewed the evidence. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen over multiple years, plus attempted murder, plus identity theft. David is looking at serious federal crimes. Sarah sat across from me with tears streaming down her face. How did I marry someone capable of this? How did I not see it? Because he's good at hiding who he really is, I said. Because he compartmentalized his life so you only saw the parts he wanted you to see. Because when someone you love does terrible things, your mind tries to find innocent explanations rather than accept a painful truth. By evening, we had documented everything. Sarah had called her parents and arranged to stay with them indefinitely, claiming she needed space to work on her marriage. I had filed a police report and begun the process of freezing all accounts David had access to. Jennifer had contacted the district attorney's office to discuss prosecution. It was past midnight when I finally returned to my apartment, exhausted but oddly at peace. The truth was out. The evidence was preserved. David's ability to hurt me or anyone else was being systematically dismantled by people who understood his dangerousness and were committed to stopping him. As I sat in my kitchen drinking chamomile tea and thinking about everything that had happened, I realized this was what courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but action taken despite fear. Not the ability to overcome pain, but the willingness to endure pain in service of something more important than comfort. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago. Desperate, exploited, so hungry for love that I'd accepted abuse as its substitute. That woman would have been terrified of the steps I'd taken today. She would have worried about being alone, about losing her last connection to family, about surviving without David's occasional attention. But that woman had been dying slowly, poisoned by more than toxic vitamins. She'd been poisoned by her own willingness to accept less than she deserved, to prioritize others' comfort over her own survival, to confuse selfish exploitation with love. The woman I was becoming was stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. The arrests came at the end of June, just as my tomatoes were ripening in the community garden. David was taken into custody at his office in Manhattan, led out in handcuffs past colleagues who'd respected him as a successful financier. The charges included elder financial abuse, identity theft, mail fraud, and attempted murder. His assets were frozen pending investigation. His passport confiscated to prevent flight risk. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. David had been genuinely talented, genuinely capable of legitimate success. But somewhere along the way, he'd decided that taking shortcuts through other people's lives was easier than building his own, honestly. Clara called me that evening from Connecticut, her small voice confused and frightened. "Grandma, Mommy says Daddy can't come home for a while. She says he made some bad choices. I don't understand what happened." How do you explain to a 5-year-old that her father tried to murder her grandmother? How do you help a child process the reality that someone she loves is capable of monstrous actions? Sometimes adults make mistakes, sweetheart. Really big mistakes that hurt other people. When that happens, they have to go away for a while to think about what they've done and try to make it right. "Did Daddy hurt you, Grandma?" I closed my eyes, searching for words that would be honest without being traumatizing. "Yes, baby. Daddy hurt me. But I'm okay now and I'm safe. And so are you and Mommy. I miss you, Grandma. Can I see you soon?" "I would love that, Clara. We'll figure out a way to spend time together, I promise." After we hung up, I allowed myself to grieve for the family that might have been. For the son who could have loved me instead of exploiting me. For the daughter-in-law who could have been a friend instead of an enabler. For the granddaughter who would grow up knowing her father was a criminal. But I also felt grateful for the family I'd chosen, Mrs. Ramirez, Patricia, the friends at the community garden and the book club and the painting class. People who saw value in me beyond what I could provide, who offered affection without conditions, who understood that love was about addition rather than subtraction. The trial was scheduled for October. David's lawyers tried various strategies to dismiss the charges, claiming I'd given him permission to handle my finances, suggesting I was mentally incompetent and therefore unreliable as a witness, arguing that the vitamin contamination had been accidental. But the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's testimony about David's behavior and the financial documents she'd discovered, the lab results showing deliberate contamination of the vitamin capsules, bank records showing systematic theft over multiple years, character witnesses describing David's calculated manipulation of family relationships for financial gain. On the day of sentencing, I sat in the courtroom and watched my son learn his fate. 15 years in federal prison for elder abuse, identity theft, and attempted murder. He would be eligible for parole in 8 years if he demonstrated good behavior and completed financial restitution. Before he was led away, David turned to look at me. I expected to see anger or resentment or blame in his eyes. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like relief, as if the weight of maintaining his deceptions had finally become too heavy to carry, and prison offered a kind of liberation from the complex web of lies he'd been living. I felt pity for him then, genuine sadness for the person he'd become and the life he'd wasted. But I didn't feel guilty for the choices that had led us to this moment. I'd protected myself and other potential victims. I'd chosen truth over comfortable illusions. I'd valued my own life enough to fight for it. That evening, Sarah and Clara came to visit me for the first time since the whole ordeal began. Sarah looked older, worn down by the stress of the past months, but also somehow lighter. The burden of living with someone she'd subconsciously known was dangerous had been lifted. "I'm sorry," she said as soon as she walked into my apartment. "I'm sorry I treated you badly. Sorry I enabled David's behavior. Sorry I didn't see what was happening until it was almost too late." "You couldn't have known," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. David was very good at compartmentalizing, at showing different faces to different people. Clara had grown taller in the months since I'd seen her, but she still had the same wide eyes that saw everything and processed emotions with startling honesty. "Grandma, is it my fault that Daddy went away? Was I not good enough for him to want to stay?" My heart broke for her, for the guilt she was carrying that belonged entirely to adults who had failed her. "Oh, sweetheart, none of this is your fault. Your daddy went away because he made bad choices, not because of anything you did or didn't do. You are perfect exactly as you are. And anyone who doesn't see that has something wrong with their eyes, not with you." We spent the evening cooking dinner together, Clara helping me wash vegetables while Sarah and I talked about practical matters, financial recovery, custody arrangements, how to help Clara process what had happened without taking on responsibility for adult failures. As they were getting ready to leave, Clara hugged me with the fierce intensity that only children can manage. "I love you, Grandma. I'm glad you're safe." "I love you too, baby. More than you can possibly imagine." After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the life I'd built for myself over the past year. Plants on every windowsill, paintings I'd created covering the walls, books stacked everywhere, photos of friends and community garden gatherings on the side tables. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when I was younger. It wasn't the fairy tale ending where the devoted mother is finally appreciated and cared for by grateful children. It was something better. A life based on truth rather than illusion, on self-respect rather than self-sacrifice, on chosen connections rather than biological obligations. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was independent, but I wasn't isolated. I was older, but I wasn't diminished. I was exactly who I was supposed to be. As I write this story, it's been 2 years since David was sentenced. Clara visits me every other weekend now, taking the train from Connecticut with Sarah, or sometimes with her maternal grandmother. We cook together, work in the community garden, paint pictures of the flowers we grow. She's thriving in therapy, processing her father's actions with the resilience that children possess when they're surrounded by adults who prioritize their well-being over their own convenience. Sarah has started dating someone new, a kind man who works as a social worker and treats both her and Clara with genuine affection. She brings him to family dinners sometimes, and I watch her learn what healthy relationships look like, how different love feels when it's not mixed with fear and manipulation. David writes me letters from prison occasionally. They're mostly apologies, attempts to explain his actions, promises that he's changed and wants to make amends when he's released. I read them but don't respond. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require ongoing relationship, that healing doesn't depend on the participation of people who've harmed you. I've recovered most of the money he stole, though the legal process has been slow and expensive. More importantly, I've discovered that I don't need as much money as I thought I did to live well. When your life isn't being drained by financial predators, when you're not trying to buy love from people who are incapable of selling it, what you have goes further than you'd expect. My days are full now in ways they never were when I was desperately trying to maintain connection with people who wished I didn't exist. I volunteer at the community garden 3 days a week, teach painting classes at the senior center, help with literacy programs at the library. I have dinner with friends, attend book club meetings, go to concerts and movies and art shows. I'm learning Spanish from Mrs. Ramirez, taking piano lessons from a retired music teacher who lives in my building, planning a trip to Paris next spring with Patricia. I'm living the life I want rather than the life others expect from me. Sometimes people ask if I regret the choices I made, if I wish I'd tried harder to maintain my relationship with David despite everything he'd done. The answer is always no. You cannot love someone into loving you back. You cannot sacrifice enough to earn respect from people who see you as expendable. You cannot fix relationships that are fundamentally based on exploitation rather than mutual care. But you can choose to love yourself enough to walk away from people who harm you, even when those people share your DNA. You can choose relationships based on reciprocity and respect rather than obligation and guilt. You can choose to build a life that nourishes rather than depletes you. The most radical thing I ever did was decide I deserved better than what I was getting, and then act on that decision. Everything good in my life now flows from that single choice to value my own well-being enough to protect it. To anyone listening who recognizes themselves in my story, who feels trapped in relationships that drain more than they give, who has been taught that love means accepting whatever treatment you receive, you deserve better. Your life has value independent of what you can provide to other people. Your well-being matters just as much as anyone else's. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to build a life based on love rather than fear. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between family loyalty and your own safety? Where you discovered that people you loved were capable of hurting you in ways you never imagined possible? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is realize we're not alone in our struggles. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but important truths. Because sometimes, opening our hearts to painful realities is the only way to make room for genuine healing and joy. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for believing that every life, including yours, has value worth protecting.